Okay. So you move on here in this section on science and intuition and quote, in contrast to the myth that science is a wholly rational pursuit, science has always had two sides, magical and mechanical. What do you mean by magical and mechanical? And again, how does this play in someone's faith? How might it draw away for someone from a testimony or from faith in God?
Well, I'm thinking of people like David Dutch, who have written extensively on the fact that for many physicists, for example, quantum physicists and cosmologists alike, there has been an intuitive sense that truth ultimately is going to be beautiful. That some people have called Euler's mathematical equation the most beautiful equation in math, and there seems to be a common sentiment among scientists that beauty is characteristic of truth and therefore is a tool that can get us closer to the truth. We also review a whole series of historically important scientists for whom mysticism of one sort or another was deeply important to their method and their discoveries. Newton is probably the most famous, but there were others as well. And so it doesn't always take the forms today of a kind of blatant mysticism or magical practice, but it goes under other names today, as I said, the aesthetic, the beautiful, the intuitive.
So, for the question of how is this relevant, if somebody has an appreciation for these two aspects of science, again, magic is kind of misleading because it makes you think Harry Potter or something, and we are referring to just kind of unseen forces or aesthetic, non-rational aspects. If somebody has an appreciation that science involves both of these aspects, then they're going to be less likely to apply hyper-rationalism to their religious beliefs and say that if I can't defend my religion strictly in terms of the mechanics, just that one half of science, if I can't reconcile my religious beliefs with this one half of science, then there's a problem with my religion. If somebody understands that science itself also has both halves, then they're not going to have this false expectation and apply it to religion, and they're going to be able to save themselves a lot of confusion and unnecessary struggle.
Right. Another quote here on faith. Faith requires of us a resistance to cognitive entrenchment, an openness to self-correction, goes toward that humility you're talking about, and an embrace of risk and vulnerability. It's hard. Faith is hard. As you say, it is costly. And part of that cost is risk, right? How does risk play into the gospel then? How does risk become a part of your growth?
I would invoke here one of my favorite philosophers, the German Hans-Georg Gadamer, who used the expression genuine question a lot in his writings. And he says that all real progress in knowledge and understanding requires genuine questions. And what he means by a genuine question is a question that exposes us to risk. It's a question whose answer might take us in unanticipated directions. And we both think that that's a fundamental part of faith. We've been talking today a lot about the costs of faith. Faith has to be costly. But one of the most significant ways in which genuine faith is costly is in what it exposes us to, not necessarily the price that is exacted, but the vulnerability to which it exposes us. Because faith means I am going to follow the truth wherever it leads. And in that sense, I think our testimonies have to be pliable, they have to be flexible, they have to be organic. And here's again where I think that distinction that we draw between faithfulness as commitment to God and faith as allowing our conceptual understanding of the gospel to develop as new understandings emerge. I mean, think, for example, about how radically dramatically shifting many of our paradigms have been at the level of church sponsorship and endorsement with the Joseph Smith Papers Project, the Gospel Topics essays, other initiatives that acknowledge, new understanding has come to light in terms of our history and in terms of our narrative. We now might have to reconstitute how we understand the way in which the church develops, the way in which prophecy and translation unfolds, what it means to be a prophet, and all of these other terms. None of those call into question our fundamental commitment to God, but they allow us to be evolving in other significant ways.
Yeah, and this is really where we get to that connection between the two kind of halves that we talked about earlier. Faith as being like about belief, and then faith as being about relationship. So to go back to science really quick, if you have the attitude of I'm going to let the data dictate my beliefs, then you're exposing yourself to risk, right? You're saying, I don't know what the next experiment will tell me. And based on what the next experiment tells me, I'm going to have to possibly modify my theories. Now we're just taking that a step further. And in the religious sphere, we're saying my faith in God means I don't know what he's going to teach me next. I don't know how it's going to impact my beliefs. So we've got these two halves, and this is how they're unified. You've got the beliefs. These are the things that I assent to. And then you've got the faithfulness, the relationship to God. And if you are truly loyal and faithful to God, it means that you are willing to let him come down and tinker with your beliefs and say, well, that one wasn't right. This one is better. Here's how you should be thinking about this. And so you are making yourself vulnerable in very much the same way that a scientist does, but you're making yourself vulnerable not to just kind of the universe and objective data. You're making yourself vulnerable to God. And you're saying, my beliefs are up to you. Please teach me, line upon line, precept upon precept. And so this is where we unify those two halves of faith, the belief half and the loyalty and the relationship half.
I keep thinking in terms of this conversation of something that I read recently that President Nelson once said, which is good inspiration requires good information. And I think that's really, right, a wild idea, right? Because effectively what he's saying is we can't blind ourselves to new discoveries, the uncovering of new information, new data, new facts about our context, our historical predicament or the past, and that we cannot rely simply on a kind of pure spirituality segregated from other intellectual faculties and rational resources. And so I think that's another way of saying effectively the same thing that we're trying to say from the other direction. Scientism can be a problem. So can naive religiosity.
Sure. Yeah, it reminds me of, it's, if you go back and you study, which you've certainly done, both of you have done this, but if you study Joseph Smith's life and you look at the restoration and how these new things were revealed, you see this correlation with the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. And a lot of the D&C comes from this, right? And so when you talk about, good inspiration requires good information, he's got the plates. He may not always be looking at them when he's doing the translation. He's going through the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and this information there. It's almost like the Lord says, look, you first need to get this information to trigger the inspiration. And if you go through and you study the Bible, then you can come to me with your questions. So not only is the information there for the inspiration, but I think there's something in between, which would be the information allows you to formulate the right questions. And unless you have the right questions, you're not going to get the right answers. And that seems to be what the Lord is teaching Joseph Smith throughout this period here. You're going to be put in certain circumstances that are going to be difficult, where you're going to have to really ask why. And you're going to want to learn, how do I restore the entire gospel? How do I restore the priesthood? How are all these things going to happen? You need to first be able to ask these questions.
Yeah, I think, I'm just continually astonished when I contemplate the origins of the restoration and to think of Joseph, who had already demonstrated his oracular powers, right? He could commune with God. And yet here he is studying Greek and Hebrew and German in a school of the prophets, struggling through to create an Egyptian alphabet and grammar. We hear the expression heart and mind so often that it's become a cliche, but I think we have failed to appreciate really how radically innovative that is as a framework for the restoration of Christianity, the synthesis that we have to continually be renegotiating.
I want to finish up actually going right into faith a little bit more here. And you've got a section here called Faith and Evidence. Critique what I'm going to say here and give me your perspective on this. I believe that faith is not just belief. To me, I kind of look at it like, as you go through the Greek and the New Testament and you see pistis, and so many times it is translated as belief, and I think it should be faith. And it's, I think that certainly there's a relationship there, but I do think they're two very different things. Belief is something where I'm kind of putting out something out there a little bit. It might be how I'm going to act. But again, I think the faith has to do with something where the costliness of faith is what develops the trust. Just like a marriage, right? It's going to take time. There's only so much I can actually trust over a short period of time. And the longer I have that relationship, the greater that trust on many different levels is going to grow. But that trust, that faith, is built off of evidence, I believe. It is built off of evidence. And so there's this idea of, well, faith has nothing to do with evidence. In other words, it's kind of this put into the category more of a blind belief, a blind faith, which is an oxymoron to me. And it's I believe that a faith, you talk about the scientific process, which whether it really exists or not, I think that Alma 32 uses the scientific process. It's the same exact thing. He's going through saying, he even uses the term experiment. And he's going through the process and saying, look, I want you to try this out. And you take the word, try it out, nurture it, test it, which I think we don't do enough of. I mean, you need to actually test it and then see what the fruits are, see what the results are, and see if I go out and I test that faith or that belief and develop the trust in something that actually has results over time, I can have a stronger belief, I can have a stronger faith because I have stronger evidence based on that. Does that make sense to you? Does that go along the lines at all of what you think about faith?
Oh, yeah, I think absolutely. I think, the phenomenon of the new atheists who really don't deserve to be taken seriously as intellectuals or historians, but they have succeeded in kind of perverting conventional understanding of faith as belief in despite of the evidence, when it's the case that historically all of the greatest Christian theologians and philosophers alike have said, no, faith it's belief seeking understanding. It's an expansion of our avenues of knowledge, not a contraction of our avenues of knowledge. And I think Latter-day Saints especially should realize that.
It's interesting to watch what's going on with the new atheists now, because they kind of don't have a home anymore, because with the postmodern pushes that are going out there, they're like, wait a minute, I want nothing to do with this, and so they're kind of like, where do I go? Where do I go here? You actually see a lot of political new political alliances that are built off of those that are really based in hardcore reason, and that's all that exists. Yeah. Along with others that are actually very Christian or religious, because they're both pushing off of this postmodern move. It's kind of interesting to watch how this is unfolding. Faith is a relationship. Faith being, let's say it's trust, or you're just saying it requires cost. I think about the faith of Abraham, right? This is a big part of what is actually taught also in the New Testament. It's the faith of Abraham. What does that mean? He's put through a test with Isaac that is not logical. To try and get reason out of this is very, very difficult. And even when you look at, you can look at Nephi and Laban, moving beyond what seems right, going against a certain law of God, although you can substantiate it based on the law of Moses, et cetera. But it seems like, as far as we want to go in building a relationship with God by being obedient and following the commandments, there's almost another step that goes beyond that. And it's almost like saying, look, you need to obey the commandments, but it's actually beyond the commandments where you have to go to, where you have to have faith and trust strictly in me, and be beyond your decision and your agency of commandments, beyond anything rational, the relationship that Abraham is given the opportunity to create goes beyond any rational measure that you can think of.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing us to here is a point with which we conclude our volume. And that is that the dimension of faithfulness that we end with is the recognition that faithfulness is a response. We don't just create ex nihilo this relationship or this set of propositions. That faithfulness is always a response to a history. And we see this specifically in the case of Abraham. We see it in one of its most beautiful manifestations in that revelation given to Oliver Cowdery, where the Lord says, if you desire further witness, cast your mind back, right? So what he's saying there is, remember our history. Remember prior interactions you have had with the divine. And so that's why I think one of the most repeated verbs in the Book of Mormon, right, is remember, 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 because what that's reminding us is that faithfulness is always about a history and a willingness to move forward in light of that past.
I'm privy to a certain study that's recently been done in the church, and it's not on members leaving the church; it's on members coming back. And what they found, I don't know if this has been published yet or not, but it's what they found is that despite what someone has gone through to leave the church, maybe it's church history issues, maybe it's LGBTQ issues, maybe it's being offended by somebody at church, maybe it's laziness, maybe it's sin. Regardless of what the issue is, the number one reason why people come back to the church after leaving it is a relationship with God. It's number one. And they may not have resolved any of their issues, their doubts, their problems, their other relationships at church or doctrinal issues. They may not have resolved. It's all sitting on the shelf perhaps still. But the number one reason they come back is because they missed having that relationship with God, regardless of the issues that may have brought them away from the church in the first place. And that seems to me is such a powerful message of faith and what that really means, and having that relationship with God, how important that is, regardless of our rationality, regardless of temporal issues that we might experience. It still ends up being the desire to have that relationship with God.
No, I
just found that interesting.
I think that is interesting. I think it's highly significant. It brings to mind two related indications of that principle. One is, in John 6, when his first disciples leave because the teachings are too hard, right? The expression that is used, I think, is so poignant, right? After that day, many of his disciples walked no more with him. So it didn't believe anymore, rejected these propositions, had troubles with, right? They walked no more with him. And then Marcello D'Ambrosio, one of the great historians of early Christianity, he said the first Christian martyrs didn't die for an idea. They died for a person, out of love for a person. And I think it seems to be symptomatic of some kind of problem we haven't articulated, that people talk about leaving the church. And it seems to me that that's symptomatic of a problem if their primary expression of religion is the institutional affiliation and not the relationship that institution is supposed to ground and support.
Yeah, I think that's right. Finishing up here, writing this book and putting these things, these ideas together and focusing on the idea of faith, to a message to somebody that is struggling because of secularism, even though you're saying that's not the problem, but secular beliefs, scientism, things don't seem rational. in a concise manner, what is your message to that person based on the findings and the writings here in this book?
I would go back to something we kind of said earlier, and
I'll let
just
Nathaniel take that one.
I would say be skeptical of your skepticism. And skeptical doesn't mean that you're just kind of dismissing it. Like, that's not what I'm encouraging at all. But be willing to question your reasons for having questions in the hope that you can learn more. I just be humble about your assumptions, be willing to revisit your expectations. And I guess the other thing that's a little bit unrelated to that, but I also think is very true, is you have to believe something. Everybody has to believe something. And so don't give up a belief that you have now unless you're giving it up for something better. And I think that's kind of one of the most tragic things that I often see with people who go through a faith crisis and decide to leave the church for a time, is that a lot of the times it's not to join another church where they found something something beautiful and true. It's not because they found some new higher thing that they like even better. They're giving up something that made their life rich and good for a long time for nothing. And I just think you should never do that. Maybe you need to change your faith. Maybe you need to go somewhere else for a time. Theoretically, okay, fine. I can believe that. We ask other people from other faiths to consider leaving their faiths to come to ours all the time. So we should at least be willing to entertain the idea. But that's the idea of exchanging some truth now for even more. And if you're not exchanging some truth now for even more, then what are you doing? Don't think so much about the defects in what you believe now, because you're a human. Humans are fallible. What you believe is wrong, period. What I believe is wrong. All of us believe wrong things because we're imperfect. That should just be baked in. So the question is, what's better? What's going to be more true, more beautiful, more beneficial for your life? And if you have kind of that attitude, those two things, the kind of skepticism of your skepticism, the questioning your questions, if you have that, and you have this desire that you should be looking for something more and better and truer, and not just discarding what you have because it's imperfect. Of course it's imperfect. How could it be perfect? I hope that those might be helpful things. And that's what I'd want to say.
Appreciate that. Terryl, anything else?
Yeah, I would just say that one of the curious phenomena that we see in this world of rampant disaffiliation is how questions go viral. And it seems to me that's just a prima facie evidence of inauthenticity, right? Which is, authenticity is such a favorite word in today's climate, but it's like, why do we become so preoccupied with questions that weren't our own? So I guess my advice to somebody who's in the midst of a faith wrestle would be, formulate a question that is going to help you find out how to make God more present in your life. And don't just parrot other people's questions because they've gone viral on the internet, but make sure your questions are your own.
Great advice from both of you. All right, Terryl Givens and Nathaniel Givens. The book is Into the Headwinds, Why Belief Has Always Been Hard and Still Is. Loved the book. Be a writer, R-I-D-E-R, and make the choice to go buy the book and take a look at it and find out more about the elephant. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Greg.